Welcome to Programmable World, a podcast all about tech ventures, the stories behind them, and the wisdom gleaned from lessons learned. My name is Dan Ilett. I'm an ex-tech journalist, and today I help tech companies to go to market, raise their commercial value, and win more business. I've worked with some of the biggest brands in the world on storytelling, brand, launches, and sales, having launched a few of my own tech companies as well. I love hearing people's stories about how they contributed to their ventures and what they learned on the way. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a business leader, or interested in technology, Programmable World will ignite some sparks and get you thinking about what's possible. Welcome to Programmable World. My name is Dan Ilett, and today I'm joined by Irene Sandler, the VP of Marketing for Cognizant. Now, Irene's going to talk today about the modern workplace, status intelligence, and how B2B marketing has changed since the pandemic. Welcome, Irene.
Hello, Dan. How are you?
I'm all right. We just had to reboot this because my mic failed. So,
technology.
How are you doing?
Not too bad.
Good stuff. So we met properly just before the pandemic, kind of talked quite a lot over the pandemic with work and with a bunch of other conversations that were going on around, I guess, tech marketing, what was going on in the pandemic and so on. Like, what did you learn over that period? What was the biggest takeaway for you?
Yeah, that was definitely a pretty surreal time. It felt like if you put yourself back at that time, April 2020, whenever it was, it could have easily gone the other way, the full apocalyptic scenario. So we just didn't know, right? We were all sitting kind of on a big pile of uncertainty. So I think what I took away from it mostly is uncertainty actually has a nice flip side, which is that it unleashes your imagination. It creates a lot of space for creative thinking, and possibly some of that got used with a lot of catastrophizing, but it does make you rethink a lot of ground truths, as it were. So personally, it was really interesting because at the same time we were juggling a whole bunch of things like parental duties, teaching duties, work duties. It also made us rethink how these types of tasks normally get done. That was interesting to me. And of course, naturally, the way companies have been reacting to it, you can see in the headlines everywhere, the big struggle of returning to office these days. It also, that uncertainty created a lot of kind of an explosion of different ideas and innovation, creative thinking on how do we get work done. So I guess my main takeaway is that no matter how much is hitting the fan, in fact, the more stuff that hits the fan, the kind of more opportunities there are to reimagine the status quo.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? When you see people under pressure, how they respond and how creative they become. That capacity for people to perform suddenly increases, and not in work really, but just thinking their way around problems and challenges and so on.
Absolutely.
Just to see how whole economies kind of got around that. I mean, I remember, we were buying food from these guys used to come and do food drop-offs at our house. I don't know who they were, right? I don't even know who they were, right? But they brought these beautiful boxes of food and vegetables and, butter and milk and things around. And I don't even know how it came about. I think one of the neighbors told us about it. But all these little systems popped up out of nowhere to survive. Right. It made me think of my dad. My dad went through the war. He was in World War II. And he told me all these stories about how people got through things and survived and did this, that, and the other. And I just couldn't really see it. But I think for the first time, I got a glimpse of how people adapt, I suppose, really well under these sort of crisis situations.
Yeah. I also learned that it takes a family of four a really long time, about 2 years, to get through 40 kilograms of rice. So there's some ration education here that I can apply, hopefully don't have to apply, but could if I needed to.
Stockpiling, eh? Yeah, I mean, we did some stockpiling. We didn't do a lot, but, everybody went to the supermarket thinking there's not going to be anything on the shelves next week. It was a kind of weird one. I think we got through the food a little while ago, but coming out of that pandemic, which a lot of people, including me, seem to have almost forgotten, because there's so many bits of it that are just so strange now, it feels. You work in the tech industry, and the tech industry suddenly went bananas because everyone wanted tech. Everybody wanted to get on the cloud. Everybody wanted to work hybrid. All the things that had been said for 10 years before this, in terms of what tech could do, suddenly everyone wanted it now. What did you see in that period, professionally from the tech industry?
Yeah, as you say, it absolutely went bananas. Every company suddenly had to figure out hybrid work, including ours. We had quite a dramatic set of efforts to get laptops to all of our employees. As you know, there was a run on laptops. We weren't the only ones. The company I work for has 350,000 associates. So most of them had been on site at these massive campuses. and to get everybody a device so that they can continue working and servicing our clients, basically. I remember that there was even a call for these kind of chunky desktop computers to just get computers into people's houses, right?
Yeah.
And then with the lockdown, how do you actually manage the logistics and work with the local governments to allow you to be driving on streets when there's, let's say, a curfew? So that was a huge challenge internally. And then externally, you're right, the demand just exploded. So you had this massive leap in demand and then kind of a decrease in our capacity to respond to that demand because our own team members were in lockdown. Well, the mother of invention is necessity. So it definitely created a lot of opportunities for us to come up with, again, those creative ways of solving the problems.
A lot of things in COVID and over that pandemic period kicked off not just a hybrid way of working, but really started to force people to look at a more modern way of working, I guess, and taking on modern tools to work. The modern workplace is something I've seen you talk about a lot, in our conversations, but actually, your posts and your blogs and the content you produce tends to be focused around those topics. So, topics of diversity, kind of eco-leadership, hybrid working, all kinds of things that need to be, considered for a modern company to take lots of people in a direction. Do you think it's exposed like a real lack of balance in the workplace as well for how people really need to work as opposed to how they're working today?
Absolutely. I think you take the two things that we just talked about, right? So the kind of unleashing of creativity, because you have to, on a personal standpoint, kind of at a family unit level or a household level unit. And then that big disparity between our ability to supply versus the explosion in demand, right? Laptops, cloud computing, security. Security was a huge one, right? How do you get all those computers networked in on a VPN in the same way without kind of killing your servers? So those two put together, I think what they did was cause a rethink, not only in kind of supply and demand in these kind of economic terms, but also in what people want out of work, right? We were forced to confront our mortality in a way. That sounds a little melodramatic, but we were like,
it's true. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and anybody who's gone through COVID knows it's definitely not your run-of-the-mill kind of cold. It can really flatten you and you can really start thinking, I actually may not get out of this, So very sadly, a lot of people didn't. So when you have that kind of level of deep thinking and then seeing kind of the disruptions as well on multiple planes, right? We have these elements in our life, our work, our family, our health, our hobbies and pursuits. And when they're all taken out of whack, out of balance, it does make you kind of go back to what your first principles might be. And so for me, this is manifesting in kind of rethinking what is the purpose of work and, beyond the kind of pragmatic parts, how do we make work more compelling and appealing to people? Obviously I'm not the only one, right? There's tons of discussion about purpose and stuff like that. But I do try to take a little bit more of a pragmatic view and kind of, instead of surfacing these big, broad ideas of like, oh, we must have purpose and what's our statement of purpose and what's our mission, is really kind of getting it down to that atomic level of the team, manager of the team. And I think that's where a lot is missing right now. It's one thing for these top executives to say, yeah, we've got a purpose and a mission and a responsibility and all these things that go beyond mere shareholder value. To be frank, I think a lot of that is lip service. But what's not happening is drilling down through the managerial ranks, how to be a good leader and how to drive performance, how to create areas of psychological safety, how to presume benign intent, right? How to get rid of all that toxic competition that is not always necessary. And it brought me to mind, there was a recent report that just got published last week, MIT Sloan Management Review. And it was a study of almost 1 million US Army service members over a number of years. And it concluded that well-being, what they called happiness in the headline, was the single strongest predictor of outstanding job performance. Single strongest predictor. Yet, you look at what we're talking about, and the metrics we still focus on are these kind of CFO type metrics, right? Even though the single biggest contributor to productivity is happiness, and then that, of course, automatically flows to the bottom line.
Incredible. You were writing recently about something called status intelligence and how to successfully navigate, the corporate. I mean, you've worked in some huge organizations delivering on brand and so on, and sort of being right at the epicenter of a lot of change communications and external facing campaigns, really, huge ones. Right now, for example, I mean, Cognizant is a great example. It's a US-based company with a workforce in many countries. You're based in London, but the biggest clients are worldwide, right? And so to communicate anything to that client base or to that market and to compete must be incredibly difficult. Status intelligence, would you mind just explaining a bit about what that is and what they do with it?
Yeah. It's the ability to kind of understand the dynamics between different individuals and different groups. So unlike emotional intelligence, which is kind of having empathy and understanding kind of the feelings that the person you or the group that you're talking to may be experiencing, putting yourself in their shoes. Status intelligence is more about understanding kind of, to put it crudely, like who's on the way up, whose star is rising, and whose star is maybe descending. I think a lot of people may call that politics, or the application of status intelligence as politics. But to me, it's really just kind of human interaction. That's really important to know, or at least be aware of, that it exists. First thing is to just be aware that it exists. There are people in organizations, large organizations, with more influence than others, and to pretend otherwise is not realistic. But I think it all comes back to my early career was all in startups. And so the status intelligence applied to kind of our startup relative to a whole bunch of other actors and stakeholders and players in the market, right? Analysts, who can make or break you on a magic quadrant, or competitors or large incumbents that had a lot more marketing dollars and innovation budgets than you did, right? So it's just understanding how you are relative to, any other kind of entity. And then back to that idea, right? To me, the atomic unit here is team. Doesn't matter how big the company is. If you can get the team to perform, and then if you have status intelligence to understand how other teams are performing relative to yours, not so much that you beat them, but that you kind of put together the right plans and motions in place to kind of get the major things that you need to get done as an organization done.
Got it. Yeah, it's an interesting concept, right? There's people who live on status intelligence and the gossip that comes from it, I suppose. But, and you meet those guys sometimes in all walks of life. Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective on how you navigate an organization.
Well, you bring up a really good point. Yeah, it's like technology, like it's a neutral tool. So status intelligence is a neutral skill. It's how you apply it that determines whether it's beneficial or not. And to that, it's really about, the mindset of the leaders. So if they create an environment where it is very competitive and very kind of dog eat dog, then yeah, people are going to deploy status intelligence just to forward themselves for more kind of selfish means, or that their team even, But if the mindset of the leaders at the very top is like, look, we're all in this together, we really need to solve X, Y, Z problems, then in that case, having status intelligence is a way of achieving those goals in a much more smooth manner.
When you think about that and what's changed in the workplace from kind of the pandemic, and how people have sought a greater balance of life and a greater recognition and greater voice, I suppose, to a large extent, so that they can have more creativity. I'm sure if you ran a study on how creative can you be at work and how happy are you at work, the two things would come out pretty similarly, right? But, in large companies, it can be really difficult to be creative because you're often not allowed to work outside of the boxes. But I think, with the pandemic, where people that everything was being reset almost on a kind of daily or weekly basis, people started to seek it more. And yet, when you look at marketing, which we spend a lot of time talking about that, my argument is a lot of things changed in marketing over the pandemic, particularly through how you grab attention, what messages really work with people. And it came down to, from my perspective, from the work I was doing, it was all about becoming a lot more personal. Voices and faces had much more impact than writing and facts and and reading. And I guess the stuff that people had with the structures, people wanted to connect with more people, I suppose. So it was a much more organic kind of way of marketing that was working. I noticed digital channels just after the pandemic just died because everybody had overload. But I mean, you've seen this on a different level, in a different perspective from a Fortune company. Have you seen similar things, or would you say, pretty much everything stayed the same from a customer engagement perspective?
Yeah, there's kind of two outputs of the pandemic, things that changed radically, but then kind of reverted to the norm or the previous norm, right? So kind of this V-shaped or a U-shaped phenomena. And then there are things that kind of fundamentally change. I think one of the things that hasn't fundamentally changed is the role of marketing, right? The role of marketing is to match an offering to a need in the market, an offering from a company to a need, it's a problem solution. That hasn't changed at all. And I think where the change has happened is what kind of offerings and products are being produced to accommodate a changed need. But the motion of marketing has been essentially the same. But you're right. There's less tolerance now for kind of the, recitation of facts and features and things like that. I think there has to be a lot more, to use an overused word, authenticity, and kind of a unique sense of authenticity, not the types. Do you remember that there was this really funny parody montage of a bunch of brands that had put out ads? These were mainly consumer brands that began with some variation of a somber voiceover and these uncertain times and
I haven't seen it.
Unprecedented, and they start with these visuals of empty streets, and then they end with these visuals of kind of families hugging each other and yes, we'll get through it together and all that kind of stuff. There was no differentiation, right? It was all the same.
You kind of hit it on the head. There was a phase where, you've seen this as well, where literally every thought leadership article that was being produced would start with, in this unprecedented time, or, these unprecedented changes that are occurring at the moment. The word unprecedented just kept popping up again and again and again, and then the next stage would be customers they're still demanding more in these unprecedented times and so on. It was just like every article you were reading was kind of written by the same person in the same way. And I think to that extent, it almost exposed how robotic some of that thought leadership work and those thought leadership marketing campaigns can be, which was kind of fine pre-pandemic because people sort of went, we know we need the important stuff to look at. We know we need the important research to kind of hang on to make a point or to engage with. But I think COVID just sort of ripped off the Band-Aid on that one and made everybody go, oh, this is a bit boring. Can we do something a bit more interesting than this?
Yeah. And as you know, like our business is a little bit, it's not the big brands. We don't sell to consumers, but our pool is the Global 2000. That's our target audience. We should have a pretty good idea of the 20 or so people in each of those 2000 companies that really matter and what matters to them. So you said personalization, which is definitely part of it, but to me, that's just a fancy way to describe kind of basic empathy, like understanding where they're coming from and what they're trying to do. You have like a pretty limited pool there. It's not rocket science. It's not something you really need to automate or scale because there's only, max 40,000 people you need to be reaching out to. It has changed in the sense that, at least in the B2B space, I think, which is that to really stand out from the crowd, it's not enough to be authentic, right? Whatever that means, but it also needs to be incredibly tailored. And the buying behavior that has both changed and not changed in the pandemic, right? It's changed in some ways that people are prioritizing certain business outcomes over others. But it hasn't changed in that it has always been trending towards kind of this federated buying, right? There's no single decision makers in a Global 2000 company. Even if I want to, buy something, there's at least 4 or 5 people involved to varying degrees of influence in a purchase decision I make. So this kind of idea of understanding the dynamics, maybe status intelligence comes into play here, right? Just applied to how is this client or this customer, how are the relative positions of this federated group of people that I need to influence? Who's going to be my biggest influencer? That comes into play now to help you make a more efficient sale.
That's a smart way of approaching modern account-based marketing, right?
Yeah.
This is something that I see personally where a tech company is incredibly good they're really good at what they do, but they can only think in the box of what they do. And to have a sort of a conversation over and above that remit is really difficult for some sales teams and account teams, for a variety of reasons. Maybe they've had their creativity stifled a bit, or maybe they just don't want to do that because they won't get bonused for going over and above, or, the incentives aren't there, or maybe they're just a bit scared of going and doing something, making more of a creative sale.
You're absolutely right.
It's that value. It's not even value sales. It's just like having the guts to go and have a creative conversation, get around a whiteboard with someone ultimately.
Yeah, well, a lot of them don't feel prepared for that, right? And in the past, it's been okay because you get this template, right? This ABM template, it's got this, the parts of it that you're supposed to, the box, as it were. And I think that the content that goes into each part of the template, it used to be really generic. That's, in these unprecedented times, customer change, all that whole stuff. Right? So, but now it has to be really relevant and resonant with the particular buyer that you're trying to reach. And that gets a little bit scary, but it's a great opportunity. I'm always advocating for marketing and sales to work more closely together, right? It's a great chance to kind of tap that kind of outside in view that marketing brings with the inside out motion that sales is trying to affect, to say, hey, this is, our stuff is worth consideration. So there's an opportunity here, right? But there also has to be the acknowledgement that it is the message that matters. And maybe that's, going back to your question, more of the fundamental change into marketing, which is that message has always been important, but now it's even more important than ever to get it right. Right.
That tailored message, especially, because I think where a lot of the problems stem from is the desire to scale everything as quickly as possible. Because of course, scale, it leads to revenues, right? But you often miss that value sell. And I think if you look at in the big tech deployment, especially the companies that service the FTSE, the Fortune companies as implementers, integrators, service providers, consultants, they're really struggling right now to find differentiation. And it's because they have just focused on, going big, scaling and so on. And it's why a lot of agencies or sort of hybrid agencies have been acquired, and new sort of innovative digital kind of companies. And I don't really think it's that innovative. It's just they've given themselves permission to go and have bigger conversations and draw a diagram or make things look nicer and speak in a different way, where the essence of what they're saying is not always that, dissimilar, but they've given themselves that permission to go and create, right? But I think it's really hard for a company that's been so used to scaling and delivering and thinking in that sort of hierarchical fashion to go and do something like that. And I'm sure that's the next thing to get disrupted in the tech space.
I think you're right. And I think companies who can't make that transition will get left behind, right? Like that's another transition. So saying meaningful stuff to the right audience at the right time, all of that has been valid in the past, but is becoming even more critical as the attention spans wane. There's almost like and buying groups become larger and they all have different kind of careabouts, right? So there's this orchestration that's also needed that is a level of sophistication above how it used to be.
Do you think that the large tech companies are, I work with a lot of startups, right? And, help them to find the funding and do the go-to-market, et cetera. And one of the common assumptions they have is that big companies will work with them and big companies will invest in them, big companies will buy them and so on. And sometimes it's right, but it's a much more painful path than everyone assumes because, like you say, it's committee-based buying, and the committees are not just 5 or 6 people in some of these circumstances, it's sort of 30, 40 people. And a lot of them are there to say no because they're risk and security and legal people, right? They're there to sort of shut the door and keep companies like that out of the way. Is that changing, do you think?
I'd add another challenge in addition to the kind of committees and the risk mitigation and this. In fact, this is at the company I currently work. I started there in our in-house incubator, right? So not only do you have, as a startup, not only do you have other startups to compete with, but you've got the internal incubation effort within the entrepreneurs that you have to compete with as well. So at the same time, it's really, really difficult for large companies to innovate internally. I mean, there are just a whole bunch of, structural and attitudinal and risk and compliance-based reasons why large companies find it so hard to innovate. There's kind of anything from, what's the model for encouraging that? If you centralize it, by definition, you're losing a lot of innovation at the edge. If you apply different financial requirements to them, very few large companies have gotten that right. So I don't want startups to lose heart. And certainly, I've spent I guess it's not most anymore, but it used to be most of my career in startups. I do think that things, not to sound too depressing about it, but I do think it's actually going to get harder in the short term for startups. Because if you look at the kind of macroeconomic environment we're in, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? Are we going into a recession? Are we not going into a recession? What direction are interest rates going? All these kind of massive macroeconomic concerns. And when that happens, especially publicly traded companies, their risk and compliance teams go into overdrive. they are very, very worried, right? Because the crystal ball, which was never very crystal clear to begin with, becomes absolutely useless. And they're beholden, if they're publicly traded, to their shareholders. So their risk appetite really goes down. Though the flip side of that could be kind of a silver lining is kind of from an acquisition standpoint. Because then if a startup is acquired, then of course the risk can be mitigated because it's controlled to a large degree by the acquiring company. So, I mean, it's both a good environment and a tougher environment at the same time.
The same view seems to be shared across the industry right now, which is venture capital companies. But UK venture capital companies just have a very small appetite for risk. Whereas, if you talk to a US venture capital firm, it's a very different conversation you have, and with an almost different founding belief behind it as well. But, the VC companies here, I'm going to be quite critical of them because I find it infuriating how little risk they really want to take. They almost look for more reasons to say no than to encourage a conversation. And yet, if you talk to the family offices, you talk to the high net worth, even private equity companies and the mid-market, these are areas that all want to get behind new innovation and new technology. But in a way, like you say, listed companies, it doesn't work with the ecosystem. And the VCs seem to have just gone down a really similar kind of corporate mindset path in this country. There's no creativity. There's no it's really hard to get past them. I don't even know if they are the ideal investor to get behind people. But from my observation, the high net worth community in that family office space seems to be competing. And certainly if you find people who've trodden a path before, it's a friendlier place to be because they can open a lot more doors and things. And that, from a go-to-market perspective, there's a lot of bonuses from having an investor who really gets what you do. I'm being a bit critical here over the top.
No, I mean,
they do have expertise in these areas.
Well, what you get with VCs, not to defend them at all, but is a little bit more scale possibly than just a family office, right? So
100%. It's true. It really is about the VC you work with and so on. But it's just an observation, and it's not only mine. I've heard it from a number of people over the last year or two. It's a really interesting time like that. But I think it reflects the corporate attitude. I tend to see the two things working synonymously,
Well, I don't know. I mean, with interest rates going up and, cash isn't that cheap anymore, you might see some American VCs acting a little bit more like turtles too. So we'll see.
So Irene, what is next? What's kind of coming up for you this year? What's in the plan?
Yeah, well, when things are uncertain, going way back to where we started, it's a kind of also a chance to be more creative. So I think where we are right now, we're looking kind of at the art of the possible, given changes in the market, given we have a new CEO. He started in January. So there's a lot of recalibration and rethinking that are kind of front and center right now as we speak. But I'm incredibly optimistic. I think one of the things that is kind of an area where we can really run is around thought leadership. The company I work for, Cognizant, has traditionally not done a great deal of thought leadership, even though we have a very good in-house research team. And where we've lacked kind of the capability in the past is around storytelling. So we do all this great research. We have all these incredibly smart, innovative thinkers with lots of points of view, but we tell it in such a way that it's kind of banal and it's boring and it doesn't really grab people. There's no lead, to use a journalism term, right? There's nothing to really hook onto. So one of my responsibilities is our thought leadership function and that in-house research team. I'm pretty excited because we have some big ideas on how to tell the existing stories we have in a lot more enticing ways, including, visual, multimedia, things like that.
So Irene, I just want to say a huge thank you for coming on the show, and I'll see you soon.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Programmable World podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. To find out more about the podcast, our guests and the topics we cover, head over to programmable.world to subscribe to our newsletter or have a look at our company at tollejo.com. That's TOLLEJO.com. Have a good day.